1 Peter 5, last section of the book. And just want to remind you a little bit, or ask a question, I guess, to start off with. And that's simply the question of what do you want as a Christian in this life? Any question, or any answers to that question? What do you want as a Christian in this life? What should all Christians' heart really beat to do or be like? To glorify God. And how do we glorify God? What's the best way to do that according to the Word of God?
Be like Christ.
Be like Christ. That's exactly right. Remember, the disciple of someone is someone who desires to be like his master. And that's what we are. We are disciples of Jesus Christ. We are followers of Christ. It should be the heart's desire of our life to be like Jesus Christ, to be able to glorify Him because we are made in His image. We are living the life He lived. We are pursuing the interests that He pursued in this life and on the mission that He gave for us as well. But of course you know that endeavor does take some work, doesn't it? This is what Paul was getting at in Philippians 2 when he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It isn't something that just happens automatically. There are concrete steps that Christians can take in order to work out their salvation, in order to see the life of Jesus Christ being lived out in their life. Of course, we can't do that without the grace of God. We understand we need His strength. But at the same time, there are responsibilities that we have and obligations that we have in order to see that being lived out in us. And it seems that in this section of Peter's epistle, as he comes down to close this letter, that he wants to highlight some of those things, specifically some of those attitudes of our lives that are so critically necessary so we can mature and grow to be more like Jesus. Someone had once called them the fundamental attitudes of spiritual maturity. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good title for this section. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever played. How many of you say, yeah, I've learned at some point in the past to play a musical instrument? Anybody do anything like that? Kind of, sort of? Stephen and John, nobody else wants to own up to it if they ever did. My kids right now are learning to play the piano, of course, and some of those practice days are harder than others. Some of you, if you've gone through that yourself, or you've had children who've gone through that, you know the motivation that the parent has to provide for that. And one of the critical keys for learning any instrument, not just the piano, is being able to get the fundamentals, right? You got to get the fundamentals down. In fact, as I was thinking about this, and I was actually working on this the other day, Clayton, I believe it was the one who was at the piano at our house. He was doing his piano practice for the day. And Clayton does not like to play the piano. He doesn't like to practice. He doesn't mind sitting, he's musical, he doesn't mind sitting there and poking on things and figuring things out. But if you actually tell him to apply his mind to actually learning some new material or a new measure of music, man, he just fights that and gripes about that and can't do it. And so the other week, this was earlier this week, I sat down with him. Now, I know nothing about piano. I know nothing about musical notes, hardly at all. And so I sat down with him and I said, now Clayton, I said, I can't help you with this, but you know more than I do about this, to be perfectly blunt with you. But what I want you to do is just apply your brain, your mind, to figuring something out. See, most of his problem is he just doesn't want to work. That's most of his problem. He doesn't want to think about it. He doesn't want to apply himself to actually do it. I said, now if you apply yourself, I said, you work on this measure right here, which was the measure he was assigned. I said, I want you to see if you can figure out what keys need to be hit and what fingers you need to use to do it. And amazingly, thankfully, he actually did that. He spent some time considering. I could see himself thinking over there, and he was playing with his fingers in the air. And then he went, oh, and he turned around, and he opened the stool to the seat, to the piano, and got out some tools that he thought he could use to help him figure things out. And sure enough, after about 5 to 10 minutes, he sat there and he played through that measure just like he was supposed to play through it. And he got all his fingers in the right place. And the reason he did so is because he spent some time working on some fundamentals. So he knew where the fingers were supposed to go, and he was able to master a certain measure that he was struggling with. But it took some effort. That's necessary to get the fundamentals down to learn an instrument. Or my kids are playing baseball right now, and we go through some fundamentals just in any sport, that's true. But in baseball, there's certain ways that the coach wants them to field the ball, certain things he wants them to do with their gloves, certain things he wants them to do with their throwing hand, and it's just routine over and over and over and over again until it becomes second nature to them. Well, guess what? In the Christian life, there are things like that. There are attitudes that we are to develop in our own spirit, that we are to practice, and that we are to go over and over and over again. And when Peter comes down to closing this book, he wants to highlight those attitudes. He's not going to say anything here that hasn't been said other places in the Bible. In fact, he is going to repeat some of the things he's already said earlier in his own letter as he closes this epistle. Say, why is that? Well, again, remember where these people are. These are people suffering for their faith. These are people under great stress. And it could be that under times of great stress, people often jettison the basic things of life, the fundamental things of life. They kind of get off kilter a little bit of what they're supposed to be focused on. And so Peter, I think, might be coming back and as he closes his book says, now listen, I've got a few more things I want to tell you, some things I want to remind you about, because if you're going to grow in the knowledge and grace of Jesus Christ, if you're going to mature in Him, there's certain attitudes that have to be absolutely central to that pursuit. Now notice in verse 5, the first word of verse 5 is the word likewise. This is not the first time Peter has used that word. If you go back to chapter 3, verse 1, I believe it is, it starts with the word likewise. You say, why are you putting that out? Because likewise appears to be one of those words that Peter likes to use to tip us off that he is changing directions. If you recall last week, we focused on in verses 1 through 4 his exhortation to the shepherds, to the elders, to the pastors of this flock. And he wants to encourage them to feed the flock of God. But now verse 5, likewise. He is moving from the shepherds, from the elders, now I could say it this way, to the sheep or to the flock of God. And he says, I've got some things I want to tell you about. And he's going to talk to different groups, some very specifically, and then more general as well as he goes through this section. So what are the different attitudes that you have to put in place that are fundamental if you're going to grow and mature in your Christian faith? Number one, let's look at it, verse 5. This is the attitude of submission. The attitude of submission. This should not surprise you. Peter has actually hit upon that theme several times in his letter, but he wants to come back and conclude with it as well. Likewise, look at it please, verse 5. You younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Let's just stop right there. So what does that mean again, submission? Well, submission means to get under the leadership or get in line under the leadership, placing yourself voluntarily under the direction of the leader. And I will say this as well, submission is one of those terms, one of those things that you're supposed to do many times when you don't agree with it. In fact, somebody once said, submission is the thing we do when we don't agree. If you agree, it's really not submission. You just agree with it, right? Submission is often the thing you have to really wrestle yourself with when you perhaps disagree with something. But Peter says here to the young, and he doesn't actually define it, he just says, younger, submit yourself unto the elder. So I want to ask the question, who exactly here is the younger? What part of the church is he talking to?
The newer Christian.
Okay, there's some people who think it may be the newer Christians. It may be people who are new in the faith, young in the faith. It may be someone who doesn't know a whole lot. Maybe they have only been saved 3 months, 6 months, something like that, and they've gotten a handle on a few things, but at the same time, they don't know as much as they think they know. Perhaps it's something like that. And so yeah, that's one idea. That could be the younger. Who else could this be?
The younger people.
Okay, the younger people in the church. Actually, just from an age point of view, it could be somebody who's just younger in age. People who have a lot of vitality, people who have a lot of strength, people who have a lot of ideas, and they have different things that they want to see done, and it's not going quite the way they want it done, and it could be that. In fact, I'd like to make a kind of connection to something we studied a while back now. But if you recall, we came across in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul addressing the younger women in that passage. And I'd like to pull on that for just a second. It could be that what Peter has in mind is the same thing Paul had in mind when he addressed the younger women in that passage. And if you remember, as we studied that passage, we decided that the younger women was actually a fairly large category of women. You say, why is that? Because Paul was addressing apparently women who were of childbearing age and probably child-rearing age as well. So he probably had in mind there anybody from young married age all the way up to the mid-50s, maybe even 60 years of age, as they still had children in the home, and they would be considered the younger women in the congregation. And I would like to suggest that maybe that's what Peter has in mind here. He doesn't have in mind perhaps the older men, someone who was perhaps over 60 or 70 or something like that. He has in mind someone who perhaps has a little more vitality in life, perhaps, a little more strength in life, perhaps, and he's going to address those who are younger. And it's possible that he actually has in mind younger men here. The reason why is because I believe this is in the masculine in the Greek. So he has in mind perhaps the younger men. You say, why in the world, if that's the case, he would be addressing younger men? Because, folks, those are the men who are probably more prone to buck against the spiritual leadership and not respect the position, as it says in verse 5, of the elder. In fact, I have a good illustration of that to some extent. This is not quite a church setting, but I remember when I was in seminary. Got a whole bunch of young hotshot guys in these classes, right? They're in their early 20s, and they have different ideas of different things they have read about how ministry is supposed to go, perhaps. And I remember sitting in a class, and it was actually my pastor who was teaching this class. And the gentleman that stood up was a friend of mine, but he did not attend or gather with our church, so he wasn't technically a pastor. But here was a man who was a mature man in the faith, a man who had ministered for the Lord effectively, a man who was a very humbled man in many respects. And I remember there was a point of disagreement in the class between that man and this young man in the class. And that young man had the gall, the audacity to stand up and deliberately contradict the teacher in the class and really press his point to the point that I'd never seen my pastor do this, but he got quite stern with the young man and told him to sit down and be quiet. He says he was out of order, the whole class knew it, but this young man didn't like something that was being taught, disagreed with it completely, and wanted to voice his opinion in a very public and inappropriate way, quite frankly. And he had to frankly be put in his place a little bit. And that man did it quite graciously, but very sternly and very directly. Well, folks, sometimes that's the case. In fact, it could be this lack of submission to the spiritual leaders of the church that can be sometimes the single most distressing issue in a local body of believers. It's absolutely foundational for spiritual maturity. In fact, it's so dangerous against spiritual maturity in the function of a local church that the Apostle Paul hits this theme on several different occasions. He knows how critical it is. For instance, in Ephesians 5:21, I'm not going to have you turn to this passage, but he gives just a general command to the whole church to be subject one to another. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But it is such a critical spirit and attitude of submission that we are to have it not just to the elder, the leadership of the church, but to one another as well. That we're seeking to integrate our lives together in such a way that we're not bucking one another even in those respects. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, I do want to read a few passages here. We studied through this passage as well. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, the Apostle Paul teaches something that's absolutely critical. He tells this church as he closes this epistle, "And we beseech ye, brethren, to know them which labor among you and are over you in the Lord." That's the overseer. That's the bishop word we talked about last week. "And admonish you," verse 13, "and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake." Not just for their sake, but for the fact of the work that they are doing, for the direction they're giving, for the teaching that they're giving. And he says in verse 13, "And be at peace among yourselves." You say, what's going on here? The Apostle Paul, as he's talking to, by the way, a very young church, the Thessalonian church, their leadership probably was not the most mature yet. Remember, they had not been saved that long when Paul writes to this letter back to this church. But he's saying, listen, there are people who are ministering in your midst. They have the oversight. They're leading. He says, now for their work's sake, love them. For their work's sake, encourage them in the Lord as well. And submit, because it's so absolutely critically important to your maturity. Of course, you're familiar with Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is probably the best, clearest verse on this. I'm going to read two verses to you. Verse 7. The author of Hebrews says, "Remember them which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation." In other words, he says, imitate their faith. He says, consider their life. They're watching for your souls. They have the rule over you. He says, now imitate their faith. Then he comes back in verse 17 and he says this, "Obey them that have the rule over you, submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls as that must give an account." He says they have a stewardship that they've been given, And they understand, hopefully, that they are given an account. Some men don't, but hopefully they do. They're going to give an account to Jesus for that stewardship. But then notice the author of Hebrews says that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. In other words, nobody wants a shepherd. Nobody wants a heartbroken leader. They don't want one who's grieving. There's no profit for you spiritually or for the church fellowship. You say, well, how in the world does that happen? How does it happen that a young person or a young individual in the church, or it may not actually be someone who's young in the church, how does it happen that they would buck their leadership and not follow the direction? Well, let me give you some suggestions. Perhaps they are someone who wants to exalt their own theories. They have their own ideas about how things should be run. Nothing that's biblical at all, but they just, some practical matters. In fact, I heard one pastor give a story one time about how he had a desire to put a chair somewhere in the church building, and he had a reason for it. And there was a church member who did not like that chair being in that location. He said that was not a good place, and it caused some consternation between him and that chair. Just because over a chair, because some guy had some theory about how he thought it should be run, and it caused grief actually to that pastor because he actually had purposes and reasons for trying to do what he was doing, and it was a stupid chair. Forgive me for saying it that way, but it was just a chair, and it just follow the leadership is what Paul would say. So some people exalt their own theories. Other people perhaps exalt their own conclusions about debatable things. Things that aren't essential, things that aren't important, but things that for whatever reason we have a difference of opinion and they think too highly of their own opinions, and it begins rocking the system of that church and of that fellowship, and it disrupts things and it causes problems. Some people, thirdly, insist on their own way about pet doctrines. I knew a guy one time. I just stopped right there. Knew a guy one time who had his very much strongly opinionated about his pet doctrines. Things that were not, they were doctrines in the Scripture, but he kind of got out of kilter. He kind of got off balanced. He overweighted his viewpoint on certain, not obscure doctrines, but just did not have them balanced in the whole totality of Scripture. And because of that, he created great havoc and chaos within a fellowship because he kept pushing his pet doctrines. And the pastor would go to them and say, listen, you got to ease off of this. You're a little bit off kilter. You're a little off balance on this. And he wouldn't do it. And he caused great trouble in the church because of that. Another way, people just often flat out ignore or disobey something the spiritual leader has asked of them. That happens when a spiritual leader just says, listen, you need to stop doing this. This is disruptive. This is problematic. This is causing chaos in your own family, or you just need to stop doing that. And they flat out ignore it. They disobey it. And it creates even more problems and even more issues. And if you're going to mature spiritually, Peter is saying here, you must be willing to submit your life to the God-ordained elders, the shepherds, and follow that lead. It doesn't mean those elders are not going to make mistakes sometimes. They may actually do that. But there should be a heart, there should be a desire that says, I want to follow the leadership of the elder that God has placed over me. And he specifically, again, targets the younger, because I do think sometimes it's the younger who does have issues with that. Forgive me for saying it. Sometimes the older people can as well. I'm not saying that they don't have opinions, but a lot of times older people have seen more of life. I think the issue here is perhaps they've grown in their maturity. They understand maybe the importance of that at this point. So Peter addresses the younger, and he says, now listen, if you want to grow, your attitude, first of all, must be a submissive attitude. Number 2, got to hurry on. Number 2 in verse 5, there's an attitude of humility. Look at it again, verse 5. Peter writes it this way, yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. Let's just stop right there. Be clothed with humility. Yes, he does touch on this attitude of submission again, one to another. So it's not just the younger, it's everybody. But let's talk about clothed with humility for just a second. What's the spirit of humility? Well, this word clothed is an interesting word. In the Greek text, it means to tie something to yourself with a knot or a bow. Perhaps you can think of a lady in the kitchen who puts on an apron because she's going to go to work and she doesn't want to get dirty in whatever she's making in that kitchen, so she puts that apron on and she ties it behind. Or you can think of a workman in some shop somewhere. They often put on an apron, a workshop, whether in a wood shop, a metal shop, or something like that, because they're going to get dirty, maybe singed in some way, protect themselves, so they will tie an apron. You say, what's the point? The point is this word clothed has the idea of getting prepared for a humble service. That's the idea. I'm getting prepared to do some work. I'm getting prepared for some kind of service. And the idea behind this is clothing yourself. And one size fits all kind of approach. We all need to have this mentality. You say, what's the mentality? We're clothed with what? Humility. Now you say, what's the word humility? It's actually a word that targets our mind. It actually has the idea of low-mindedness, lowly-mindedness. In other words, think for just a second to use an illustration. Remember back in, I think it's Luke 7, the young lady who comes and anoints Jesus' feet? And he's in a room with a whole bunch of other Pharisees, and he's at a dinner, and this lady comes in, quite a shocking scene, and Jesus is reclining at table, his feet's behind him, and this lady comes in and she starts crying over Jesus' feet, and she bends over and she starts cleaning his feet with her hair, and she's just showing this kind of submission and this kind of humility to Jesus. And the point I just want to make about this woman this morning is that this woman really wasn't even getting herself in the place where she thought lowly of herself. The point is, she wasn't even thinking about herself at all. She was thinking about Jesus. That was the point. She was thinking about how can I best show my love to Jesus. And she didn't really care what other people thought about her because she wasn't thinking about herself at all. And that's kind of the point Peter has here. When he says, clothe yourself with humility, it means get lowly in your mind. Men and women, none of us are too good to serve in whatever capacity the Lord wants us to serve in. None of us should ever think to ourselves, well, that's beyond me. I'm too important in this way. Or, you know what, I can't stoop to this low. No, that's not the case. In fact, it may be that when Peter writes this, his mind had gone back some 30 years in the past where he was in an upper room with a bunch of disciples and they were arguing which of them was the greatest. And remember what Jesus did in John chapter 13? It says he got up and he took a towel and he girded himself. He tied that towel around him because he was going to stoop to become the servant. It could be that Peter is thinking of that scene when he says, clothe yourself with humility. He thinks back of that time when Jesus took the towel and he's clothing himself because what was Jesus about to do? He was about to wash the feet, the dirty, nasty feet of those 12 disciples that were aghast that their Messiah was going to do that to them. And Peter here comes back 30 years later and says, no, this is how you need to view one another. And again, I want to remind you that this is absolutely essential for spiritual maturity. If you're going to be like Jesus, you've got to have a mindset that lowers yourself in your own estimation and recognizing I'm here just to serve. Do you remember the Apostle Paul's emphasis in Philippians 2? I know I've emphasized this because it's absolutely critical for a local church to understand this. But in Philippians chapter 2, he's been talking about how we live the gospel one with another. And he says in verse 2, fulfill ye my joy that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. Here it is. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. So what's Paul getting at? He says there's a certain mindset you've got to adopt. If you're going to walk together in unity and fellowship one with another, you've got to adopt this mindset of humility of spirit. Paul calls it the same love, but it is a love that looks not on your own interest, but on the interest of others. Men and women, if you want to fracture the unity of a local church, and if you want to fracture the fellowship and the impetus that a church has one with another, all you got to do is just exalt your own opinions higher than they ought to be exalted. And lower, instead you should be lowering your opinions and saying, you know what I think really isn't that important, because what I want to do is love one another. What I want to do is serve one another. And folks, people often do this. Again, they come in with pet positions. They elevate their own perspectives. Sometimes they say, well, I'm doing this to protect my family. Perhaps I'm arguing for things that they think are important. But this passage is telling us not to think of ourselves at all. In fact, it is a fundamental, listen folks, it is a fundamental, concrete element, if you will, of the Christian life that we exalt one another, not ourselves. That's it. But how often we think too highly of ourselves. In order to do this, to borrow upon another phrase of Christ, it means dying to self. It means dying to self. That's what it takes. To think to ourselves, you know what, my opinions about things that are just debatable just aren't that important. That I have a fundamental calling by Jesus himself to set aside my own opinions for the sake of loving and serving one another. That is the mind of humility one with another. In fact, Peter goes on in this passage here. Look at end of verse 5. And he quotes an Old Testament passage, one you're very familiar with. It says, God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. God resists the proud but give grace to the humble. He's quoting from Proverbs 3:34. You say, what's pride? Well, that's just elevating your own thinking above God's thinking. The classic illustration I like to use is my own children. I've used this before. But my children, I often say, is some of the most proud people I've ever met. They got two parents that can have a problem with it too sometimes. Say, what do you mean? Well, you know what? We often think of someone who's proud as someone who's just arrogant and haughty and they got their nose up in the air. But that would be a little bit of a wrong characterization. The reason I say my children are proud is because I can give them something to do and I can walk in their room 10 minutes later and find they're not doing it. And I'll ask them, now, didn't I just tell you to do something? And they'll say, yeah, you told me to do something, but it's always the but I, and they give me what they want to do. And maybe it's play with their Legos, maybe it's read a book, whatever it is, and I go, yeah, but was that what I told you to do? And they said, well, no, it wasn't what you told me to do. But what are they doing when they say they had a better idea than my idea. Folks, I like to suggest to you that that's pride. They thought more highly of their idea than my idea. And how many Christians are guilty of doing that? They think they have a better idea than God's idea. That's simply what pride is. Pride is assuming I know better than God. Remember, that's what Satan did. I will be like the Most High. I will exalt my throne above the stars. That was Satan. I will be better. I know better than God. I'll put myself above God. And we walk in the pride of our spirit. Well, guess what? God resists people who exalt their own opinions and their own thoughts above God's thoughts. And by the way, I should say their own mission above God's mission as well. We have a fundamental responsibility to exalt others above our own agendas and opinions. Again, don't think too highly of your opinions, especially when they are in a debatable area of life. If you want God to fight against you, then just get sidetracked with your own agendas and your own opinions. Guarantee you, God will fight against that. He will stand opposed to you if you're not adopting his viewpoint in life. Proverbs 6:16, very famous verse, these 6 things that the Lord hate. What is one of them? The very first one, a proud look. A proud look. God does not like when his own people decide they know better than him. He doesn't like it. Proverbs 8:13 says God hates pride and arrogance. God is the God who draws close to people who are humbled. Isaiah 57:15. God talks about the fact that a contrite spirit he will not despise. A very humbled spirit he will not despise. And God will bless those who humble themselves before others and seeks to serve. You know how easy it is, folks, for us to get so focused on our own perspectives. You know what? We can even deceive ourselves that we're actually doing God's will. That's how scary pride can be. We can actually deceive ourselves that we're actually doing God's will, when in reality we simply just want our own way and we make it sound so pious. That's what we do. We make it sound so pious. We think we're serving God, when really, if we really pull back the layers of what was going on, it's because we think we know better. And we're not serving God. We're serving ourselves. By the way, the Pharisees did that. I'll use this illustration. I think it's a powerful illustration. Remember on that one occasion, forgive me, I didn't look up the passage, but remember on the one occasion when the Pharisees, Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and he indicted them over a lot of different things. But one of the things he indicted them over was the fact that they had a responsibility to help care for their parents, And yet you remember on the occasion that Jesus came to them and he said, guess what you've done? You've taken everything about your resources and you've devoted it to God. They called it Corban. Oh, it's all devoted to God. And the reason they did that, sounds pious, right? Oh yeah, everything I have, it's for God's use. And Jesus says, no, the only reason you've done that is because you don't want to help out your parents in time of need. You have a responsibility to them and you don't want to help them out. So you just say, well, you know what, I'll take this very, very pious position. It's all God's anyway. I'm sorry, Mom and Dad. I can't help you out with your needs. Baloney. That's Pharisaical living. That's exalting your twisted viewpoint upon what God has said. And folks, Peter here is trying to urge this church to really shift and evaluate your life and your attitudes. Do you have a true humility toward one another? Notice as well, it does extend to a humility before God. Look at verse 6. This is all kind of bundled together, I understand that. But notice he says in verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God. He's been talking about humbling yourselves before one another. Now he's going to talk about humbling yourselves before God. How do you do that, folks? Well, notice he says here, under the mighty hand of God. What does that mean? What is the mighty hand? What is that phrase? It's kind of those phrases you've heard your whole life, but how would you interpret that? How would you explain? What does it mean, the mighty hand of God, especially as it relates specifically to your life? Okay, I think so. It's authority. It is authority. God has a mighty hand. He has the right to direct the affairs of your life. In fact, if you go back to your Old Testament and you study out this expression of a hand of God, you will find it comes up in a lot of different funny places. For instance, in Exodus chapter 3, you will find that Moses is instructed that God will stretch out his mighty hand for Israel's sake. And the implication is to protect Israel. The implication there is to deliver Israel. In Job chapter 30, God will stretch forth his mighty hand upon Job's life. Job even says it. Says, I don't know why God is stretching out his hand, and Job feels like it's against him. That's the way Job felt. And yet you find as you read through the book of Job that God's hand was not against him, but God's hand was testing him, was maturing Job. Or you find other places, such as in the book of Ezekiel, God stretched out his hand against Israel again. In that case, it was to humble that nation, to chastise that nation. And so Peter is basically coming back and saying, okay, what's God doing in your life right now? How's God's mighty hand working in your life? Now, what are these people up against? Well, they're up against a hard time. They're up against the pressures and the difficulties of their faith. They're up against persecution. And I think what Peter is saying here is don't balk what God is doing in your life. His hand is working. It is a mighty hand. And it could be that he's working in such a way to deliver you, to protect you. Maybe he is trying to chastise you. Or folks, maybe it's because he's just testing you. And he's purifying you like he did Job. I'm sure some of that clearly was going on with these believers. But what profit will it be if you argue against it and you fight against it? That's Peter's point here in verse 6. Humble yourselves under, therefore, the mighty hand of God. Go ahead and just acknowledge it and submit to what God's doing, knowing that his ways higher than your ways, his thoughts higher than your thoughts. You don't always understand what God's doing. Just submit to it. Yeah, it could be challenging. It could be difficult. It could be long-term. I don't know all the details, but I do know this. If God's going to accomplish his purpose in your life in a way that's profitable for you, it does take the spirit of humility to go, I don't know why God's allowed this. I'm not sure how he's working in my life, but the last thing I want to do is fight God upon this. The last thing I want to do is elevate my own thinking and my own opinions and my own conclusions against what God's doing in my life. So, what does verse 6 do? Say, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God. And you have this assurance, folks, notice this, that he may exalt you in due time. That's the promise. There will be exaltation. You say, when is that due time? I don't know. that's the whole point of that expression. It's in God's time. He'll exalt you. Question. How long was it for Jesus before he got exaltation? When did Jesus' exaltation come? Because he humbled himself under the mighty hand of God. He kept saying, I'm just here to do God's will. I'm here to do God's will. Whatever God allows, I'm here to do his will. When did he get exaltation? Yeah, when he rose again from the dead. You know, your exaltation may not come until you die. Can I just put that? It may be not in this life that you get exaltation. It may be the gracious hand of God that allows you to go to the grave and then enjoy the exaltation as you've lived a whole life submitted to His will, and He's going to exalt you in due time. This phrase may very simply be Peter's way of saying, and guess what? When that time comes that you die, then you'll get exaltation. Because that's the way it worked for Jesus, and most of the time that's the way it works for us as well. So, you need to have the attitude of humility. Last attitude, got about 5 minutes here. We'll close this down good. You need to have the attitude of trust or faith. Look at it, verse 7. Very famous verse. You all know it. Casting all your care upon Him, for He careth for you. This word casting has the idea of throwing something on someone or something. In fact, it's used in the book of Luke, chapter 19, verse 35, of someone throwing a blanket on the back of a donkey. Now you can envision that, right? Taking a blanket, tossing it on the back of a donkey, and what's the donkey now doing with that? He's carrying the blanket, right? You're not having to carry it. He's carrying the blanket. And that's the image here. Got any cares? Got any stresses? Got any anxieties? We've talked about this verse before, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail this morning. We all got them. Think the people Peter was writing to in his day had them? They've been kicked out of the city of Rome. They are being pressured by government officials. They had lost their livelihood. Some of them had family who had turned against them. Got any pressures like that? Well, we've all got pressures. What do we just do to them? Cast them on God. Take them and say, you know what? I'm going to hand them over to God. Now, I understand the challenge that is. That's why there are other passages in Scripture that give us some more direction of how to do that. I don't have time this morning to go into those. We've done that before. But men and women, here's the beautiful thing about verse 7. It says at the end of the verse, for He careth for you. He cares for you. And really in the Greek, it actually has the idea of, for you, you are His care. You're His care. In other words, it's like this, folks. We are so burdened about everything that's going around us, and we're so weighed down about it, and God says, you know what, go ahead and throw it on me. Go ahead and let me carry that for you, because guess what I'm concerned about? It's not those details. That's not what I'm concerned about. The details don't matter to God. Not that He's not concerned about them. It's just fact, God can do anything with details. He can change that in a heartbeat. That's not an issue. Those things are not what God's concerned about. You know what God's concerned about? It's actually you. See, you're so concerned about the details, but God's actually concerned about you. That's what He's concerned about. So, the question is, will you come to Him with an attitude of faith? Will you come with an attitude of trust and say, you know what, God, I don't know what's going on right now or why it's going on right now, and it's been going on for a while, but guess what I'm going to do today? I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to say, God, you can have that. You're going to have to carry that because that's way too much for me to carry. You're the one that's going to have to bear the burden of that. And sometimes, folks, you're doing that about every 5 minutes. Sometimes you're doing that every 10. You're just going, you know, I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust. And here's the assurance. Because God really is focused and caring for you. So, folks, 3 foundational attitudes to mature you in your faith. There is the attitude of submission. There's the attitude of humility. And there's the attitude of trust in the midst of the difficulties. All right, let's close in prayer.